Hi, I'm Raffael Jovine, and I beat the often path first by not completing a whole school year until I was 13. I was an actor and did a lot of stage work. I was a photo model, acted in some of the worst German divorce dramas on very bad television. And my rebellion against my bohemian family was to study sciences. That was the first time I sort of deviated from the often path in my own family, only to discover that I needed to do a lot of catching up in school when I did join. Later in life, I did become a scientist, and I really, really, really loved the idea of being a molecular engineer and engineering organisms. And I really enjoyed the idea of trying to improve on natural systems. And my graduate school required me to do field work. And I realized very quickly that after becoming a molecular biochemist and biophysicist from a high-profile university, that actually going to sea and seeing photosynthesis in the real world by diving under the ice in Antarctica, by going to the Central Pacific Gyre, that I actually needed to learn about the real world, and that in the real world, photosynthesis is working beautifully, super efficiently, much better than I could make it. And so instead of staying in my nice academic track, I became a naturalist and started studying marine biology. And through many twists and turns, I'm still doing that today.
Welcome back to the Beat the Often Path podcast. I'm your host, Ross Palmer. On this show, we celebrate unique and inspiring success stories to help us get a better perspective on our lives and careers. Well, my guest today is incredible. Raffael Jovine is the founder and chief scientist of Brilliant Planet, a company unlocking the power of algae as an affordable method of permanently and quantifiably sequestering carbon at the gigaton scale to help us all alleviate climate change. Brilliant Planet has raised tens of millions in funding from major partners like Toyota Ventures and many more. And when you hear exactly what his innovative approach is, you'll understand why. But beyond that, Raphael's personal story is so incredible. Learn how he made massive changes in his personal life and career that led to his biggest breakthroughs later in life. Now he's a published author and leader extraordinaire. So here's Raffael Jovine of Brilliant Planet. Well, Raffael, you are full of surprises. There have already been a handful of bombshells that you've dropped in our short time meeting each other. Hilarious stuff. I did not know that you were an actor before you began, but fascinating. Have you ever watched The Simpsons? I have to get this out there. Do you know the show The Simpsons?
I love The Simpsons.
So do you know the character of Ned Flanders?
Of course.
Right. So Ned Flanders' story arc is that his parents were these hippie bohemians, exactly, and that as him, as a backlash to that, he became a fundamentalist Christian. And that was one of the great jokes of the series, that he became that character not because he was pressured into it, but because he was rebelling against it. So for you, you have done the opposite of what you're supposed to do, because obviously everybody is supposed to leave academia and leave the business world and then become an actor, right? The ultimate holy grail is to become an actor, not leave all of that behind.
I don't regret that decision for 1 minute. Stage was a family. It was a very nice environment. People were very tight and close. The fire marshal would help with my homework. The wardrobe was the safe space. It was a great place to grow up, actually. And yet I knew very early on, I didn't know why really, and I was a kid, but I knew that there was something bigger out there and something else for me. And my family, I'm the first high school graduate in my family. And my family comes from a very sort of different background. And now, I've had 2 postdocs and I've done all the other things that, like you say, certainly nobody in my family, they still are puzzled by what I'm doing. So, it's okay.
Sure. It's okay. Well, right off the gate, we're going to dispel some myths, because people who have studied figures like Einstein or classically smart people, there is this general belief, and certainly in the field of science, that if you haven't made your great contribution to science by the age of 30, you'll never do it. Your brain shrinks. Nothing truly brilliant happens after you turn 35, that kind of thing. We've heard that. But you've done the exact opposite. You didn't even complete your first year of school until you were 13. So do you believe, first of all, that age is a limiting factor? This is a very leading question. We know where this is going. Towards making a great breakthrough or contribution to the planet?
So that's a wonderful question. I do believe that we have different skills at different times of our life, and that it was easier, certainly for me, to make some fairly complex connections when I was younger. I had more alert hours. I was more energetic, for sure. There are differences, but with experience also comes judgment and sort of an inbuilt bullshit tester, being able to know when your own ideas are maybe just a little bit too fantastical, and also the ability to understand others better. When you're young, you tend to be very impressed with your own thinking, whereas it requires experience and skill to learn from others. And so I have reinvented myself again. After graduate school, after I was a postdoc, I became a management consultant. I did work in a very corporate environment. And I was sort of very honest with myself, where I felt I was missing something. There was a lack in my life. And this is completely silly, but I would be standing at London City Airport, a very small inner city airport that's right on the Thames, and it smells like the marine environment, and the kerosene from the engines of the propeller planes smelled sort of like the kerosene on the boats that I used to do my field work on. And I'd go to these clients doing pharma mergers and all these responsible things, and I would always be hankering for this field work that had transformed me. And so I then sort of made lists of priorities for myself, where I wanted to see, what was missing from my life. And no matter what I did, it always came back to this business of doing fieldwork and doing more biological research in the real environment. And so there's also, with age comes a sense of self-awareness and recognition that you have sort of some needs that may not be met by your current job, for example. And so I then set out to try to address this. And, of course, once you've been out of academia for a while, you are not so relevant anymore. So in my case, I knew that I could do something about climate change. For me, it was obvious, even in 2004 and 5, that we needed to do something really big about climate change, and that things were running in the different direction. The rest of the world wasn't quite there. There were some people in the climate community who were very aware, but it wasn't as dramatic as it is today. And so, using my new skills from my management consultancy and my old sort of research skills, I tried to come up with a new approach, how I would tackle it. And the reason why I say that is with age also comes a larger tool set. You have different insights that are not necessarily just on the content and the subject matter expertise, but on how to deliver it. And so I feel that also as a parent, you learn a lot. My children know this, but when my first daughter was born, I never put her down. She was perfect in every way. I hated the fact that people kissed her all the time, and sort of slobbered on her. And I wanted her to be just perfect. And by the time my third child, my son, came along, and he would want to sort of dig around in the flower pots and eat the dirt, I just hand him the spoon. I mean, you discover that things are just going to be all right, and they're going to figure it out. And so, there are many learning experiences that make you a more well-rounded person that can be kind of efficient in a lot of other ways as well.
Everybody knows that carbon is one of the main problems. Obviously, one of the things you must have seen is somebody doing a core sample and discovering the extent of climate change. You've witnessed it firsthand, no doubt, pulling out this ice sample in those days. So you recognized, before many did, that carbon was a chief problem, and you knew that we needed to not just curb how much carbon we're producing, but also actively reduce the amount of carbon, because if we stop, it doesn't mean that it's going to go away. We still have to get rid of some. So when did the idea for using algae to do this, when did you decide that not only is that the vehicle for the change that I want, but also that I could build a business to do this?
When it became apparent to me, like just as you described, that decarbonization was going to be slow, I completely understand why developing countries, for example, want to develop and use the resources that they have available. I completely understand how land use change, where we take natural resources, forests, swamps, and then moors, heather, that kind of thing, and then turn it into agricultural fields, that the amount of CO2 that land can sequester through natural photosynthetic processes is reduced. And so land use change, sort of continuing human development, alone would continue to increase the amount of carbon that's either not reabsorbed or that is emitted for the first time. And so when I looked at the scale of the problem, where every year, if you look at the so-called Keeling curve, where in top of Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, Professor Keeling has been measuring the atmospheric CO2, again, since the late 50s. Every year, we accumulate a little bit more CO2 in the atmosphere. Since then, since that Mauna Loa Observatory has been started, there are now observatories all around the world, going all the way from the Arctic to Antarctica, to track that annual CO2 increase. And when you see it, it's a zigzag curve. It's a very dramatic zigzag. It's a very spiky curve. And the reason why that matters is because when Mauna Loa is in the northern hemisphere, and when there is summer and spring, there's a lot of carbon fixation happening in plants. And as the plants grow in the northern hemisphere CO2 goes down. And then in the winter, when the plants go fallow and the fields are not sequestering and there's snow in the northern tundras and all that kind of thing, the CO2 starts increasing again. And it increases a little bit every year, a little bit more every year than it did the previous year. But the movement, that zigzag, is a big movement. We're moving many, many gigatons of CO2 every year. And that just goes through natural systems and through plant growth. So when I was a management consultant, applying my management consultant sort of thinking to the problem of climate change, the question I asked myself, what is the biggest thing that I know that can move a lot of carbon? And it's cool and wonderful when people make some really nice sustainable product, but chances are they're not going to move gigatons of carbon. It's very important that we have our sustainably sourced coffee with our nice recyclable drinking cup and all that stuff. Every little bit helps. And I don't want to at all minimize the impact of that. But when it comes to the scale of the problem, it's the size of the entire oil industry emission every year that's accumulating in the atmosphere. It's a big problem. But the plant activity moves even more resources. So the question I asked myself was, how can I make a lot more biology happen? That was the real question. It had to be new plant activity. Today, the lingo is it had to be additive. It had to be something that wouldn't have happened otherwise. I didn't want to displace a forest. I didn't want to displace a tundra and just shift the problem around. I wanted to do something new. So I had spent a lot of time in my academic life working on algal blooms. These are natural events that are at the base of the food chain. These are the little microorganisms in the ocean that not only feed all of the ocean, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but every puddle fills up with green algae. If you don't take care of your pool, it becomes green. And so these things grow for free. So the question was, can I do a lot more of that to the point where I can pull down a lot of carbon? So first, I needed a lot of empty land. And when I mean empty land, I needed a lot of empty land. And in hindsight, it's exactly the amount of sugarcane crop that is out there in terms of land we need.
Interesting.
We needed a source of energy. We needed unused seawater. And we needed organisms that could actually do all of that work. So everywhere in the ocean, it looks like one giant connected puddle where everything is sloshing around. But the local environments are actually very, very specific to that place. And so the organisms that live there have had a lot of time to get acclimated and adapted to that space. And they're very good at using the resources there. So what I wanted to do was get, in a sense, local algae in empty deserts, with algae that can use that abundant sunlight that is usually in the deserts, with deep seawater that has all the nutrients in it. That was the connection. And then I actually wrote a patent. The patent got granted, which was great.
Great.
And it was called a method of carbon sequestration. And then there was this management consultant sitting in London with a patent. And what I thought was a good idea, suddenly sort of wondering, now what? What do I do with this? And then I must admit, it took a while to sort of get it right. But the fact is, that was the original connection. It needed to be additive, sort of new in the lingo, it's new net primary productivity. And it needed to be something that we could do now. I was very keen on using things that people are familiar with. People are very good at moving a lot of water, for example, to make shrimp farms. They're very good at filtering out mining fines and the little silty stuff from big mining tailing ponds and things. So there is existing technology. Where we are, you can imagine cold ocean, hot desert, there's usually a lot of wind. It's powered where we have electricity demand and paddle wheels and pumps. It's powered by renewable energies. So the idea was not to sort of create a new problem, but to do something that was very sustainable from the get-go and that would create more biology for the purpose of drawing in that carbon. And then even back then, even at the beginning, the idea was to find a very low-cost way of burying that carbon. And the that connection came from the fact that the original oil that we are taking out of the ground now used to be algae 60 and 80 million years ago. And all I was thinking is, well, let's just put the oil back in the ground again, right? So that's where that connection came from.
Super fascinating. Well, one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about, looking at the solution and your company, is typically in the news for the last 5 to 10 years. Whenever you see algae bloom, the word toxic is preceding it. And it's often billed as something that we should be avoiding, that is an unintended or undesired consequence. So what is a toxic algae bloom, and how can we do this in a way that's not toxic?
So it's a great question. And while I like all algae, you are correct. I used to, when I was at Woods Hole Oceanographic, I used to work on harmful algal blooms, which include the toxic red tides and things like brown tides. And of course, the whole idea was how to avoid them.
Right.
Of course, you're right. And what they're about 27 different organisms that either make a toxin, and some of them are really nasty. I mean, really spectacularly nasty. Or they irritate organisms, or they eat other things that you don't want. And very often they're a result of some form of environmental perturbation. So we've added a lot of nutrients to the local environment through detergents or other things. Or they're a result of the water heating up and stratifying, and you get a warm layer on top that doesn't support the sort of normal biology. And then only these harmful organisms can find a way to use that environment. And so they're often a result of things going wrong somewhere else. And you are correct that they can cause quite a lot of, damage. And that they are, some of them need to be managed and avoided. I mean, they make fumes that cause asthma, all kinds of things, diarrhea. They can paralyze you. I mean, there's all kinds of problems. So there's something fascinating about them, though. So what these organisms have figured out is you have a mixed community, hundreds of different organisms. I'm sorry, let me just put the ear.
We heard nothing.
Okay, good. Hundreds of different organisms, viruses, predators, all coexisting at the same time. And then one organism says, these are just the right nutrient levels with just the right amount of stratification. I can grow faster than the next organism. And if you just keep growing faster, you outcompete everything else and you crowd out all the other organisms. So what's interesting about these blooms, these harmful blooms, is that they find ways to sort of dominate the water column for a while. And that method of propagating that exponential growth, again, was one of those connections. I thought, well, if I can do that with the sort of normal blooms that are actually the base of the food chain that are feeding the animals in the ocean, making all the fish, the clams, the crustaceans that we like to eat, then if I can apply those same principles to maintain the bloom, then I can in a sense make these blooms happen in my ponds in the desert. And the reason why that story is important is because what the real invention is, algae will bloom naturally. Fish will lay their eggs in anticipation before the bloom happens because they're so regular. So the sardines in California will actually, spawn before the bloom forms, so that the eggs drift into the bloom as it is forming, so that the little baby sardines have lots to eat when they hatch out of their eggs. And so that phenomenon is quite predictable, but it's temporary. It only happens for about 10 days, 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks of the year. And what I wanted to do is to have a sort of commercial proposition, how to draw down more carbon, as I wanted to do it year round. And the real invention was to make that spring feeling, that thing that induces those natural algal blooms, those beneficial algal blooms, to make them happen year round. And so studying the harmful ones was actually very helpful, and provided the framework by which we could make those beneficial algae grow all the time. Just to give you a sense of the ocean, though, in the ocean, there are 5 times more animals than there are on land. So the ocean is a very rich, productive environment. We don't have the kind of big forests and the big sort of familiar landscapes that we know in the ocean, but there is actually a lot of food being produced and a lot of biological activity. The ocean at any one point in time has 50 years worth of all the nitrogen demand, so all the fertilizer demand we have on land, both the natural fertilizer as well as the man-made fertilizer, available at any one point in time. So there's lots of nutrients. The ocean has 38,000 plus gigatons of CO2 dissolved in it. In the atmosphere, we only have about 700 gigatons. So it's a very rich environment. It supports a lot of life and a lot of biological activity. So the one way to make it more additive and to make more ocean happen was to bring that deep water that would not have come to the surface onto land, make those blooms happen, take the algae out, sun dry them there in the desert, super cheap again, so that we can bury them, and then the de-acidified seawater that can absorb a lot of CO2 goes back to the ocean. But the reason why I'm saying that is we wanted to make sure that we are not taking anything away from the natural environment.
So the solution is you take the seawater out, you put it into a giant pool, you let these good algae blooms happen, then you take the algae out, you dry it, and you bury it, as you said, putting the oil back in the ground. So 70 million years from now, there will be new oil that you're creating instead of just a layer of toxic plastic that they'll discover 70 million years from now. Well, and one of your farms, if I'm not mistaken, sequesters the equivalent of 8,000 cars per year. And obviously you can do this all over the world. So it's a very, very exciting solution. And like you mentioned, you can sustainably power it with energy that's off-grid, renewable energy. How cool is this? It's a phenomenal concept.
So we're still a young company. We're still a startup. And we have now built the largest algal raceway, that giant pond, that giant pool.
It looks spectacular.
And we are in the process of building a commercial demonstrator site that does all of this in a scale demonstration so that it's really persuasive. It'll produce thousands of tons of carbon to CO2 to sequester. That 8,000 cars example is the first commercial module. That's 1,000 hectares. But we already have 6,100 hectares of land in Morocco, another sort of large amount in Oman. We've identified 500,000 square kilometers of really ideal land all over the world. So that's where the sugarcane crop size comes in. What we want to do as a company is sort of turn this into a recipe that we can give to people to show them how to do it and make it accessible in places like Chile, Namibia, Peru, the Sea of Cortez, Baja California, those kinds of places. The reason why I say that is to have that impact, there's a lot more than 8,000 cars. We got to build a lot of these farms. And yes, we'll do our bit to build those farms. But the real trick now, sort of our near-term future, is to scale everything to, a really substantive scale. The good news is, in our experience, the bigger we get, the more stable the algal growth gets. So that kind of helps. And the other good news is we found some really, really supportive, sort of very receptive funders, both here in the UK. And Innovate UK is a state agency that has given us grant money when it really mattered, as well as in the private sector, in the in the venture capital community. So I feel well supported, and I'm actually quite optimistic that we will get there in that we will make a meaningful contribution in really sensible time frame, put it that way. So by the end of next year, I want to be fully building a 30-hectare demonstrator site. But 2 years later, we want to be fully doing that commercial site. And from there on, it's just a cookie cutter where we take that model and repeat it over and over again.
Well, that's just fabulous. And obviously, I'm not the only one who thinks so. You've received tens of millions in funding, big partners so far. Very promising stuff. I'm going to close that chapter, as unbelievably interesting as it is, in the interest of time, because I want to get to one quick point before we forget, and that is that you have written a book that is very appropriate to the concepts that we discuss on this show, and also to your general philosophy, of which I'm a big fan. And that book is called Light to Life in some areas, or How Light Makes Life.
In the US, it's called How Light Makes Life. And it's a book about photosynthesis, and it's not a book for scientists. Over the years, I've run into lots and lots of different ideas how all of us, each one of us, even in the middle of a city. I live in an area of London where there hasn't been a tree in 2,000 years, can actually make a difference, and where each one of us can either behave differently or plant more things. And since I like planting things, it sort of was all about photosynthesis. But when you tell the story of photosynthesis, there's one big misconception, which is that biological life responds to external sort of signals, and that sort of physics drives the system, and geology makes the resources, and biology kind of adapts. It's sort of the receiving end of the forces in nature. The way I see photosynthesis is we've got that sunlight. It has started 4.5 billion years ago, right at the get-go, when the planet was this toxic, brown, acidic, anoxic marble. And it certainly was a very hostile environment. And in that hostile environment, these little biological organisms started growing. And the first thing they did is they cleared out the oceans. They changed the oceans to the degree where all that acid sort of literally started precipitating out, and all that iron started raining out. And they changed the geology and the chemistry of the ocean. Then they changed the atmosphere. When these algae grow and sort of settle out, they get so heavy that they crack the continents and the continental plates and are a factor in the kind of tectonics that move the Earth crust around. And so the way I saw it is there's one consistent force that, driven by that sunlight, has continued to grow from the very beginning. There was very little life in the beginning, in these little niches, in these tiny, tiny little sort of mud domes. And that life has just increased and increased and increased. Every so often there were some setbacks, some ice ages. But the fact is, when it comes to clearing out an entire atmosphere of toxic stuff and changing the world, biology has done it over and over and over again. And so it's a growth story. And the reason why I thought that was very cool, when we all feel like we're running out of resources, actually nature has made more resources available than in any previous epoch or era. And as nature grows, it creates more living spaces. So it's actually, our planet is, from a biological productivity point of view, it's actually growing. So that was cool. But the other part that I really enjoyed about writing that book was that the people who figured all of this out were definitely the often path beaters. They were everything from mystics, priests, doctors, showmen, entertainers that were trying to figure out how all this stuff kind of works. And they did this through very difficult times. The Spanish Inquisition chasing them, the French Revolution, periods of starvation. And yet they sort of found a way to stay, in a sense, positive in those times. And so what I also wanted to show was that, things are difficult, but we can help ourselves. And people have done so. People are pretty ingenious, actually, and they come up with pretty awesome solutions. And there's 8 billion of us. And if 8 billion of us kind of try to do our little bit, we can actually get a really long way. And so I part of it was also sort of trying to create a little bit of a message of hope that we can do something about this, and that we don't have to be, there's so much negative news and it can be very shrill, but that not everything has to be that shrill negative news. So that was the other reason to write the book.
Let's get a clap for that one. Love that. And I need a copy of that book in my life. I'm going to purchase this immediately. Will you hold it up for the people who are watching? This is the non-US version. I know you've got one right there. There we go. This is brilliant stuff. Light to Life, How Light Makes Life. I do want to leave the last word, just as you were able to open this episode. You can close it out. So any action, anything you want people to do, you're going to wrap this up. What do you want people to know?
So when you read the book very quickly, there are examples where some very humble people who really don't have much in life, who happen to like to drink beer, for example, just fill that beer can with dirt, put a sunflower seed in, and then grow sunflowers and roast sunflower seeds. It doesn't take money. You can do a lot. Every fruit has seed in it. Avocados. I've got lots of avocado trees. You can do all kinds of things with just a little bit of ingenuity. Internet is fantastic for finding recipes of how to grow things. And you can do a lot, but it's also healthy. It makes you engage. It's nice to watch a plant grow simply because it's slow and it grows and it does it on its own and it has this whole program of developing. And so it's just fascinating to do something that is in a different pace than normal life. So it's good for lots of reasons. So thank you for this show. Thank you, Ross, for doing this. And it's much appreciated. I really enjoyed this too. And good luck out there.
Thank you, and same to you. Right. Although I don't think you need it anymore. I think you'll be just fine. With that, the official podcast is over.